Good morning, Charles. Well, welcome to the audience to the Heliostar Metals and Agentis Capital webinar. My name is Michael Gray. I'm with Agentis Capital as a research analyst, and I'm here with the CEO of Heliostar Metals, Charles Funk. We're going to discuss the July site visit that Heliostar had. I was an analyst on, wrote a research note. This was to the Unga asset in the Aleutian Islands. And we're going to discuss that vis-a-vis a fireside chat and really focus on 5 key takeaways that I had. Before we get into that fireside chat, Charles is going to provide a corporate update so everyone's up to speed on Heliostar corporately. And we're recording live, so please, anyone in the audience, if you could mute your cell phones and devices, that'd be great. Also, I want to alert the audience to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll be taking some questions at the end of probably about a 45-minute webinar we're planning. As far as Agentis disclosure, in the last 12 months, Agentis Capital has been retained by Heliostar in an advisory service, and we've received compensation for that. Also want to highlight that Agentis Capital does hold a long position in the stock, including some warrants, and I personally, as an analyst, do have a position in Heliostar. I'm going to turn it over to Charles now for the update.
Perfect, thank you, Michael. And the aim is just a very brief introduction here for context. I suspect most people are broadly familiar, but that'll just set the basis for some of the points and locations that Michael visited and that's been a focus for us. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So for people who are new to the story, or just a sort of a refresher, you know, we have the Unga project in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. We fit as an exploration play in that exposure to discovery, given that we've got a large district with a huge amount of upside from our perspective. The nice thing is that's backstopped by a very high grade resource, 384,000 ounces at 13.8 grams per tonne. Especially given the sort of current risk-off nature of all juniors. I think with the valuations that juniors have relative to us being backstopped by this resource and then the potential that we have at the project, I think it's nice to know that there's some comfort and a buffer there. The great thing about being in Alaska is you've got that huge upside potential that these districts are known for. You know, it's such an underexplored part of the United States. And it's got huge potential, but normally it's limited by infrastructure. And I think that's something we might touch on today. But one of the nice things about Unga is it's surprisingly accessible. We've got a major airstrip that we have daily commercial and charter flights to. It was a 2.5 hour flight down from Anchorage. And it does surprise people. It was a tongue-in-cheek comment from the analyst tour that it's the frontier potential with Amazon delivery, and we like that, and we're sort of seeing if we can use it a little. And then the other key takeaway from us from the site visit was we hadn't done a good enough job of showing people how big this district is. And I'll let you bring up a couple of slides. You can find this is the basis of a new corporate presentation that'll be live this weekend. And so in terms of the size here, before we zoom in, you can see we're about 900 kilometers southwest of Anchorage. But as we noted, it's got an airstrip that you can land a 737 on. It was a 2.5 hour flight down that we took down, and then it's 5 minutes from there across to Unga where the camp is. So really accessible, and being so far south, it's got that 9-month field season at the moment. So we were there in the very beginning of April, and we're there till the very end of November last year. So it's a unique feature of a project that's not common in Alaska, is how long that field season is. In terms of size, you know, this is a slide that we put together in response to some of those comments from the site visit. And you can see on the right that there's a 25,000 hectare district, now 250 square kilometers we've got. That's a huge package of ground. It's got veins spread all across that district. But the key thing that we've really noted is despite being a big district, despite having that resource at SH1, it's a project that's had fits and starts throughout its history. To explain that very briefly, it was Alaska's first underground gold mine. In 1886 it was found. It produced until the 20s and sort of fits and starts into the 30s. We might talk about why it got into base metal rich material that technically they couldn't recover the gold from. And then the project sort of sat there until the 70s. There was a bit of porphyry exploration, including Zachary Bay, which we might get to. But then the best work was done in the 80s. 3 different companies explored here throughout the 80s, but they all had different parts of it. One group had this Apollo corridor, another group had the resource area, and then a third group had everything else. And so that was a really good pulse of work, but it got lost in an oil and gas company through the early 90s to the late 2000s, before Red Star picked it up, and though they were focused in Ontario and then Nevada. And then they finally turned their attention seriously here in sort of 15 to 17, mostly focused on SH1. And so to illustrate that, like you can see a chart in the bottom left there, in the last 30 years, there's been about 20,000 meters drilled. Half of those have been drilled by us in the last 12 months. So I think it really highlights the lack of exploration this district's seen. And then we've attempted to split that out by resource. You know, 99% of the drilling outside of the resource has only been done in the last 12 months, so over the last 30 years. So we're trying to show that this is a very large district, but it's also a very virgin district. It's only seen the very basic exploration and commonly only surface exploration. And when I say it's a large district, you know, this is an attempt to show that, you know, too often we look at projects in Alaska relative to the whole of the United States and everything looks small. But Unga's a big island, you know, it's about 10 by 15 mile island. And you can see here compared to some of the major districts, for people who know me, I worked on Panuco last year. And this was a good slide that got a lot of traction to show how big a vein district can be. And the reason this is critical is only a small part of a vein has the gold in it. So if you don't have a big vein, you can't put together a big resource. And so this is a comparison to some good analogs that geologically make sense. And the attempt is to show that we've got a really large footprint. All of these are at the same scale, except the difference between these other districts is they've had decades of continuous exploration. In all instances, you know, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars spent on it, whereas we're really at the start of that curve with our project at Unga. And so we focused our program, and I think it'll be a big part of today's conversation, on sort of 4 or 5 key target areas. Clearly the resource, which is open to expand. We've had some really good results this year from our drilling at Apollo. You know, for the first time ever, we found the vein in drilling. We can actually tell you the dip of the vein. Incredibly, in 135 years, there was no one quite knew which way that vein dipped. We're following up on Aquila. We put a couple of holes into a porphyry target that we think are a little interesting, and we'd love to come back later in the year and do some work at Centennial, because the nice thing about Centennial is we can explore that year round. So this is just the basis for that. We might touch on with some questions, but corporately we have results coming from all of these targets over the next couple of months. There's been a break in reporting results because we systematically rushed all our samples when they could influence the exploration program. And at the point they could no longer do that, we stopped rushing them and went to normal process. And that's left us with a hiatus through August, which we expect to have our first results from the normal course process, probably coming through in the first 1 or 2 weeks of September, and then results from then on. So I think these slides just set the scene for anyone who's not familiar. And Michael, maybe hand back to you from your initial impressions on how you got there and what you saw.
Yeah, yeah, and you've obviously modified the slide deck. This is great to see in terms of incorporating some of the site visit commentary, and certainly what I used in my research report. But yeah, I think your first point in terms of the access and location, I had it as my site visit takeaway number 5, was quite illuminating. I didn't expect, realize we were on Tidewater in the Aleutian Islands, but to have Sandpoint as a community with that daily, flights and the 5-minute helicopter ride over to Unga, no one living on Unga Island, and appreciating the access throughout the target areas. That was fairly illuminating to me. I guess the question for you, Charles, is there are both opportunities and challenges with that access. Maybe you can address, sometimes you get fogged in, and that'll impact things. You do have a lot of existing roads and great footprint of areas you can drill, and you can. I also want you to address the fact you can essentially drill at will as opposed to onerous exploration permitting.
Yeah, well, there's probably a lot of points there. I suppose the interesting, that history that I touched on meant there was a town built in Unga. It was supported by a cod fishery first and then the mine. And when that mine shut down, the post office finally left in the 50s, and the last person left the township of Unga to the southeast of our project in 1969. And so it's not this, it's got this modern history, which means it's not shown on this map, but there is a road network between SH1, Apollo and Aquila in particular. And so one of the nice things about having multiple rigs that we did for the program that we've just completed is you do get the western part of the island can get fogged in, and this part of the world, despite we got amazing weather for the visit, in the shoulders you do get a lot more rain, and the weather gets more difficult to deal with from a helicopter perspective. And so having multiple rigs, having the RC rigs that you can move around quickly, meant we could be really adaptable. And if the weather was looking bad, we'd focus on Apollo. If the fog wasn't there, and sometimes that sea fog would just come in and sit for a couple of days. And so I always liked, when I did the due diligence before we formed Heliostar last year, was that this is a project where you can structurally lower the costs of operating. Once you get to beyond that, once it's a project that's ultimately going to make it into production, you can build the infrastructure, which is really just an airstrip, reuse those roads and take advantage of that existing infrastructure to actually explore quite cheaply. So having a lot of targets and having that road network is, again, a bit of a surprise, but very useful for us.
And you mentioned the RC drilling. Maybe you can touch on that in terms of, it's been a huge opportunity to very productively get a lot of holes drilled into certain targets. But on the other hand, it limits you in terms of what depth you can test some of the targets. Well, I think we'll come back to that a little bit later, but maybe you could address that head on right now.
Yeah, so we wanted to, I don't think a district like Unga needs anything, it doesn't need something magical and special to show what it could become. It just needs systematic exploration and using the tools that the industry does well to your benefit. And so, as we showed and we talked about, all the focus in the last 30 years has been on SH1, and it's delivered a resource that we think we can grow. But what's really attractive here is this district scale. You can see here on this map all these targets. And the problem when you have a big district and you're a small company is you have to find a way to unlock that sensibly, without so much dilution that it becomes not a profitable exercise to do that. And so our approach has been use that as an anchor and then go to these high probability targets. And as we talked about, like Apollo, a mine, the old timers showed that there was more gold with base metals, which was their problem for production. But it had never been drilled, or at least the vein had never been found in an attempt. There was one attempt at drilling in the 80s, but they didn't hit the vein. There was only a couple of holes at Aquila, but we knew from the trench work that there was good distribution of gold. So the nice thing about an RC rig is it drills quickly, it drills cheaply, and so you can cover a lot of areas. So we got to about 5 target areas. We'd love to do another program that would test probably another 10 target areas. And it's that first pass drilling to say, did we upgrade or did we downgrade this target? Because there's plenty of targets on this property that have outcropping, high grade gold, anything from sort of 2 to an ounce gold that's never been tested. And so do that first pass drilling quickly, work out, does it have potential to have volume? And then if it does, we come back with a diamond drill rig in a more systematic program later. So its downside is that you don't get drill core, so you don't have as much textural information. But we actually, there was Sam Anderson, our VPX's initiative, brought a televiewer to site. So we actually have a digital version of the core and a photo down the hole showing that. We just got that data last week. So we've offsetted that. And the other downside is you don't get as deep as you'd like. But you've got to start somewhere. So we start with the shallow drilling. And then if we get good results like we did at Apollo, we come back deeper with the diamond drilling later.
Okay, fair enough. And you addressed kind of my number one takeaway was the consolidated land position, the fact you're doing systematic exploration, kind of answered it, but I think your previous slide showing the different districts, the footprints of those vein fields, and the fact that, this is a intermediate to low sulfidation vein field, you would expect multiple deposits and multiple, whether they be open pit or underground opportunities. Maybe if you go back to the plan map, the next slide, maybe just, in the US, you often don't get all the data. They don't have the assessment system we do, but it looks like you've got most of the data. That's maybe a good comment on the value of that, how much time it's going to save you, and the fact that the project's consolidated. Again, I think that was a key thing for me in terms of 50 years with, exploration, really focus on 1 or 2 points, certainly historically the mine, and then more recent operators on SH1. But we've come a long ways also in our geological understanding of these vein fields and models and where you should be laterally and vertically. Maybe just highlight that systematic approach you're going to take, given you have the entire playing field.
Yeah, and so that you're right, that starts with leveraging information you don't have to pay for. And so that work that was done in the 80s did collect a lot of surface work. And so incredibly, a lot of that hadn't been digitized, and we're still catching up on that. So we're lucky that we got access to most of that. Red Star have done a good job of accumulating it, but it hadn't been synthesized into a single data set. And then it's very hard to compare things when they're not in the same data sets, and particularly when they're not digital. So, leverage off that work, that good exploration work that was done in the 80s. There was a lot of preparation work done, just not a lot of drilling done in that campaign outside of the SH1 resource. So we've gone through and digitized all of that, and that starts to show you the patterns as you know, and you're sort of hopefully not putting words in your mouth, but epithermals like this often occur with multiple shoots with a sort of a periodicity or a control. There's either a dilation zone, so where the vein changes, or where another vein hits that vein. That is always a good spot to deposit mineralization. And these districts, if we'd gone to the next level of detail and showed where the mineralization is in these districts, it's in half a dozen to a dozen zones throughout those that get treated through a central processing facility. And so effectively, the previous explorers have found 2 of those with any significance here, SH1 and Apollo. But the size of the district, the amount of outcropping mineralization, and our understanding, I've had the good fortune through my time with Newcrest and more recently with Wiesler to spend a lot of time on epithermal systems. And they have a pattern and they have a zonation, and you use those tools to systematically vector into the best parts of the system. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that you believe in one target. It's not Aquila or Pook or Apollo and say 100% this is going to work. For me, it's a statistical approach where that if you have 10 or 15 high probability targets, if you work through those methodically, one will surprise you. A few will disappoint you, and a few will be sort of what you expected. And so you just need to work through them, which is our approach. And then you've got to balance that with the capital markets, that you have to raise money to do this. So you need that right mix of excitement and good results. And you saw the results that we got at Apollo, and that got a great reaction for us. Pity the market wasn't a bit better. We probably would have held on to some of those gains. But you're sort of balancing that, systematically working everyone through the pipeline from a prospect through to a drilled off target, and then making calls along the way about whether the volume's there. That's probably a long-winded way. I hope that sort of answers it.
No, I would agree. Let's shift gears before we get into the specific, say, the targets and the endowment potential. Let's shift gears. And one of my takeaways, number 4, was just on the ESG, in particular, how you're going to handle relationships with the, they're somewhat complex, as I learned and spent quite a bit of time on this, but the Alaska Regional Native Corps, the Village Corps, and the tribes, I really highlighted that you have a, what I would say, difference maker consultant in Joy Huntington, and that with her background from the Doyan region and being Athabascan, to me, brings to bear an inherited trust. So I was quite relieved that that was an area that I think, probably your corporate culture dictated you were going to maybe do something like that anyway. But maybe you could get into a few details on your corporate social responsibility program, the way you're interacting with the villages, and Joy's, a little bit on Joy's background.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have Joy. So I think it comes back to, as a management team, being that little bit younger, we're probably brought up with quite a modern view of what the base level standards are for our industry. Sam and I both worked for major mining companies, so we probably got that drummed into us as much as any technical knowledge. And at the end of the day, I come from a farming community in Australia. I know what it's like to live in a small town and have pride of the land that you own and the industry that you have. And I realized that anyone who comes into that community has to play a role in that community. And so, I don't know a lot about commercial fishing, but I actually feel quite at home in that small community setting. And so you can have all the best intention of the world as a management team of saying that you will do all these things day in, day out, but you have a lot of jobs when you run a small company. And so we wanted to find someone who could help us day to day, week to week, build up our relationships, build up, the employment opportunities that we can create. It's so mutually beneficial for us to employ people from 5 minutes from the project, as opposed to 2.5 hours away. And so we asked around in Alaska for who had that inherited trust, to use your word, and it was really clear that Joy has a huge reputation in Alaska for doing this. So Joy started with us early this year, and our mandate's really simple. The long term, we would like to build a mine at Unga, but it's probably more important for us that the communities that we work in make informed decisions, because they don't know the mining process, because they're not, their grandfathers were miners, but today they're fishermen. So we just want to become part of the communities that we work in. Just before you came, we had a community meeting with 60 people, and it was great because we're at the start. We don't need anything particularly. We're not asking for permits to build a mine. We just wanted to say, this is what we'd like to do. These are the risks, these are the upside. We're here, reach out to us. And Joy's been really critical for that. She's a huge asset for our team.
Okay, no, thanks. I think that's important. And this is your first time as the CEO. This is putting your stamp on things and the ability to hire and create that, call it, corporate identity in the community. Maybe just touch briefly on the what you're experiencing so far, and able to direct the company from this position as opposed to a little bit lower down, because the responsibility and the what's involved being a CEO is quite a bit different.
Yeah, it's an interesting code. There is another level of responsibility when the buck stops with you, as opposed to you say, well, I gave it my best, but someone else is ultimately at the end. I think the key thing that I wanted to do was build a team of people that I enjoyed working with, that I think can build real value. And so it's nice to be able to build that team, because it's just a unique nature of the way the deal was done, that there wasn't a large legacy team. And so we started from scratch. So to have people I'd worked with before, like Stu Harris and Mahesh Lahanagay, to have Sam and Joy join, to have Rob Gray and his background with XX Story, all of a sudden you've got a team who is hungry to achieve something. And it's a cliche term, but bench strength. It's nice to know that if we need to achieve something, you can say Sam or Joy go and it's going to be done well. And so having a team of motivated people trying to achieve something with a blank slate is actually a pretty rare opportunity. And so we're just trying to do justice to the opportunity.
Yeah, good. Let's go to my second takeaway was we're seeing 1 to 3 million ounce potential. That was really through a lens of covering a lot of companies over the years. In my background, developers and producers, and that endowment potential, specifically with the legs of an intermediate sulfidation system, deeper vertical profile potential. And you pointed out the periodicity. Certainly, these can be shooty deposits. You don't actually have much outcrop overall. But the thing that raised my expectation on endowment potential was the lack of exploration in general drilling outside of a few prospects, and the amount of cover you have. I guess the assumption that everything would be resistant and sticking out of the ground. And then the high hit rate in terms of the amount of relatively high grade gold you have, given the amount of outcrop you have. So maybe you could just touch on that, and also the fact that it's a bit more of a gold rich setting.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, what's a good graphic to actually, the first one here. So this is a looking at the background of this. It's not the best one. In the valley at the bottom is SH1, in the far north of the hills where Zachary Bay, the porphyry, is hosted. But most of the country is this rolling hills you can see in the midground or the foreground on this slide. And that means there's very good outcrop at the top of those hills. But as soon as you get down into that dark green, it's buckbrush and it's tough going. It can be half an hour to walk a few hundred meters. People mightn't believe that, but once you're in it, I know it's really difficult. And that does mean that, outside of these little sort of, these targets, that it hasn't been well connected geologically as a district. It hasn't. People sitting back haven't been able to sort of just walk that corridor and find all those zones. And you've commented on your experience. I've seen it. That's the exciting part here, is that there should be multiple more of these targets along these vein corridors. And maybe I'll slip ahead so that people can see them here. These major corridor trends. Yeah. We've got some old magnetic data that supports that really clearly. These fluids come through and demagnetize the rock, so you get a low magnetic strip. And it was some commentary from the analyst visit as well that, love a detailed mag survey. And we would love a detailed mag survey as well. We've put it in both of the budgets we've had, and it hasn't made the final cut for the reason that it didn't change the next round of drill holes. But it's a fair comment. If money wasn't an option, it'd be one of the first things you'd do, because you get the detailed orientations of the veins with a detailed magnetic survey. And anytime that vein bends, breaks, dilates, I often draw it on Apollo down here. Oops. Sorry. Here, if you can see the way the vein was tracking along when it curved to the north in this sort of rhomb shape. There's no coincidence that the change of angles is where the gold's dropped out. So knowing that on a big scale helps you find these shoots.
I certainly flag the need for a mag survey for the bigger picture. Also, really, in terms of the endowment, looking for you guys to establish that fingerprint of mineralization. I think you're a long ways there on SH1. in terms of some of the understanding in a very short period of time. Maybe just comment on given there's more data to synthesize and you've got more results to come, where are you in that process of potentially getting that Rosetta Stone or fingerprint?
Yeah, I think at the level of how to pick and prioritize our targets, we're a long way there, in that we know where to go looking in the vein system and how to interpret the textures. In that next level detail down, that sort of super understanding of which phase came first, base metal rich mineralization or gold mineralization, that's what we're still learning. We didn't know what way the vein dipped at Apollo before this year. So we were missing some pretty fundamental information that we're now improving on. And when we talk about this model for people who aren't super familiar with it, intermediate sulfidation veins typically vary. There's always, it's a general rule, not a specific rule for every deposit, but typically they're gold rich in a shallow level. Then they become sort of gold, silver, start to get base metals, and ultimately base metals only with depth. And this is an old long section at Apollo, highlighting this, the small area, the shallow area that we drilled with the RC drilling and got the good results from. But they mined gold in the top 800 feet, the top sort of 350, 400 meters. But they drew this thick black line from the old mine time because that's where the base metals came in. And, that's 1,600 feet, nearly 500 meters. That's a huge vertical range, which is a great tick for endowment. Now, it's why we like the depth potential at Apollo, because we're at SH1, because we're only down about 250 meters. So we understand broadly that zonation and how to pick our targets. But once we're within that, we've relogged SH1 and learnt that there's a Gingero banded phase that helps with the high grade gold, that there is a coarse grain gold element that can give you some extremely high grades, but it's more erratic nature. And we're just starting to get some of that knowledge now at Apollo, in that it's not so simple as just gold at shallow and just base metals at depth. You can transition from gold to base metals over as little as 25 meters. So it's a lot more complex.
Yeah. Maybe you could pop up the SH1 long section as well for that point. In terms of a thing that impresses me too, a lot of these systems can have chutes that end, but then start up again to depth. I certainly remember that at Cerro Moro Extore. So, maybe just as we're on this slide, the plan going forward for sketching in chutes to depth.
Yeah, so there's the comment that we just made that this, and I probably should do a better job of drawing them to the same scale to show that, but you're down about 250 meters below surface here. There's mineralization at Apollo and another 250 meters down. That combined with when we pull up some of these drill holes, and sorry for everyone listening, you've got two geologists talking, so we can drift into a fair bit of technical jargon, but there's clasts of chalcopyrite-rich material in the vein. So that tells you that there's more base metals deeper. It tells you the system's alive and transitions as you'd expect at depth. Maybe one of the downsides of epithermals is it's just drill density to solve that problem. And so we haven't probably put as many meters as we'd like to in SH1 for two reasons. One is because we want to show district scale at the same time. The other one is our diamond drilling hasn't gone as well as we would have hoped. When you put small contracts out, it doesn't always go as efficiently. One of our strategies corporately is do more of the RC drilling so that you can come with a bigger diamond drill contractor and get those bigger companies, and it makes it a bit easier when you've got more rigs, more drillers, more support to have a more effective program. But effectively, we just need to step down deeper. We know ultimately it'll become more base metal rich, both from the model and the evidence shallowly. But we think, as you said, they pinch and swell. You can get dead holes in the middle of good ore shoots. It's a density of drilling business. And so we need to drill this white space underneath to the same density as the shallow space. And I think that sort of 0.5 to 1 million ounce is a reasonable target there.
Let's go back to the main slide with all the trends. Yeah. And just end in terms of the site visit takeaways on the, I call it the plethora of targets, an array of opportunity. but with that also comes, an opportunity cost by spreading out your efforts maybe too much. Maybe you could address that in the sense of there are a lot of exploration techniques and tools you have, whether it be the surface geochem, rock and soils, geophysics, the quartz textures, as I highlighted in my report. How are you going to navigate to the best portions of the trends and the best targets as fast as possible, given you've got so many?
Yeah, I jokingly said the other day that, if this district is an elephant-sized district, we've got to eat the elephant. And how do you do that? And the answer is you've got to start somewhere. And so that's why we've picked out these higher probability targets where you've got open intersections. You've got gold at each of Aquila, Centennial, SH1, Apollo. That's open for expansion, and it could be what we think is the backbone for that first million ounces of this district. And so why we focused on those, they've received the bulk of the drilling this year. As I mentioned, we'd love to get to Centennial in the winter and look for the high-grade feeder zones at Centennial. That's just straightforward exploration. You know where the veins are. There's good grade gold at surface, but they haven't been well drilled or expanded. Apollo, the vein hadn't been drilled. Aquila only had a couple of holes over a big trend. Centennial, we've got that model change of looking for the high-grade feeders to the lower-grade flat-lying resource. And we just talked about SH1. So start with high probability, deliver the kind of results that we have for Apollo. They're pretty spectacular results for a first-pass drill program. Then in the background, which is not the sort of sexy work and doesn't have a lot of market appeal, but Sam's brought some very good geologists to site to systematically map, sometimes sample where we needed additional sampling, all these other targets in the background. And that's what we sort of show here. There's, so we did work this time on Rising Sun, California, Empire on the Apollo trend. Pook and Orange Mountain, Bloomer Ridge and Gyra, we worked up to drill ready this year on the Shumigan trend. Norm's Vein, Disney, Zachary Bay, we did a bit more work on as well. So in the background, we're working up these other targets to be drill ready. And so you always need those. The way my experience these districts work is you just need that bit of luck to get onto one zone that gets the market's attention. That's what happened for me at Vizsla last year. We drilled a high-grade hole in a good market, got everyone's attention, raised a lot of money. And that allowed you to go and keep expanding that, but go and drill a whole series of other targets without much attention on them. And you see how well that's worked at Panuco in now that there's multiple discoveries in that district while the main one's heading towards resource. And so that's, I think, how we're going to approach this keep delivering on these advanced targets. Look to see how quickly we can get to that 1 million ounce framework, and then consistently work up the targets in the background and hopefully surprise people with some new areas over the next couple of seasons. So
great, Charles. Let's move to some Q&A. We've got a little bit of time left. In some areas of the US, there are extraction agreements that allow removal of ore without processing in the state. Is that a possibility since you have a resource?
Without processing in the state. I think there's two parts, if I understand that question. Our land package is a mixture of patented claims that we own 100% with no royalty. So the whole Apollo trend is 100% owned by Heliostar. And that's really nice. From an economic perspective, there's zero royalty burden on that. Our SH1 claim is a state claim, and it has the 3% net interest royalty to the government. And then the rest is an agreement we have with the Aleut Corp. Very pro-business partners that we've really enjoyed working with, and have structured an agreement that has the exploration agreement with a built-in mine lease, and that has a sliding 2 to 4% ultimately royalty depending on the gold price. So if we were to produce from the federally patented claims, then there's no royalty to anyone at this stage. It's a financing option or just a higher margin option for us. I think the question might be there though, also whether you could process ore outside of the continental US. And actually, there's a bit of history there. You mentioned Explore. My introduction to this project was through Bryce Roxburgh, who was successful at Explore, and they tried to acquire this project. And they were looking at it potentially you could direct ship this ore because of your proximity to Japan and Korea. It would actually be quite a cheap cost with that grade. So it's way too early for us to guess that. There's no reason you couldn't do that. I suspect that you'll find a spoke and a hub model. Actually, I'm probably jumping to a question that you might be about to ask, but
no, that's great. Here's a really good question. Why are the Aussies so focused on Alaska? And I'm sure that includes, Northern Star and South 32 and others, including yourself. Given your background, why are they?
That's a good question, because I think on last count, if you count us as a Canadian company with an Australian CEO, I think it's 7 companies from significant majors to juniors, all in the last few years. So I actually asked you this question, and I thought you had a very good answer. So instead of me answering it, why do you think, Michael?
Well, I think the Aussies were looking for growth opportunities outside of Australia, and there's a couple of reasons. I think Alaska in particular, because they like the security of the system, where especially the native corps and the certainty. So that was one takeaway. The other one was they're leading the world in underground mining technology, I think, and so they're doing it more efficiently and at lower cost, and they've brought to bear those techniques not only to Pogo but also to Red Lake Evolution, what they're doing. So I think they see opportunity not only for discovery but also to improve mine efficiency and lower costs.
Yeah, it's certainly a trend. It's gone beyond just being a coincidence in Alaska.
Yeah. Here's another question, one from George. Since it had past production, meaning Apollo Sitka, and there are tails that have been assayed for past recoveries, are there tails that have been assayed for past recoveries in other metals?
Yeah, very little. There was some work done in the 80s on a very small volume of tailings. They were actually so the mine produced very profitably. I think they made $3 million worth of money in the day at the turn of last century. And then they came back and built a cyanide plant a few years later and reprocessed the tails using cyanide to recover the remaining gold. And they did that on the edge of the coast. So most of those tails don't exist anymore. It's more about that the old timers found extensions to the old mine that they couldn't process because they didn't have the technology. In fact, I owe Sam the explanation. It was interesting. It was the way they produced back then was a stamp mill physically just crushed it. And we walked over the old stamps in the site visit, and they'd just crush it to a fine size. And then they'd run it over an amalgam plate, which is essentially a copper plate with mercury on the surface. Gold being heavier would be at the bottom of the rock flour and would get caught up and then just forgot the word, would get caught up with the mercury. And then you'd make a mercury gold amalgam. But what happened was when it's caught up with the base metals are actually relatively light relative to the gold and would stay up with the rock flour. And so they just pushed the gold with the base metals all the way off the edge of the plate and wouldn't recover it. That was kind of a cool little lesson that I didn't fully understand until Sam explained it.
Yeah, no, that was a good explanation from Sam. One more question. How many portals were there, and have you drilled from underground in the past production?
So there's 3 main shafts and there was 2 portals. Those shafts are sort of open in the sense that we can find them and they're open today. They are all flooded now. There was an attempt to de-water those in the 80s. They got down to about the 100-foot level, so they didn't get below what was mined. So it's a question we've had a couple of times about, it'd be great to do that. I think we've now got the zone. We've found a couple of chutes. It's quite clear for us at Sitka. It's a little more complex in that shaft 2 area. But step down with the diamond drilling, and once we've got a bit of a grid drilling, then I think we could look forward to the rehabilitation options. There's a lot of forward-looking statements in this answer, but this is how you would go down this pathway. And then you would look to rehabilitate. You know, those timbers are over 100 years old, so there'd be quite a bit of rehabilitation once you did that dewatering. But they're there. They're definitely an opportunity. There's a lot of reports in those old mines of, we opened up this part of the vein, but it was base metal, so we did no mining. So there's a lot of opportunity here. There's a step forward of more systematic surface drilling before we get there, though.
We'll have one more question, and then I'll give you time to close because we're getting towards that 45-minute stage. This must be from a shareholder. It's from Dave. Talk about the prize. How big are you thinking the district has? Monster grade and width similar to Japan. Must be pointing towards some of their Ishikawa type deposits. Do you think the island holds multiple bonanza zones? And I think you had forward-looking statements in your slides there somewhere. So go ahead, Charles.
Without trying to be too promotional, I think very clearly there's evidence of two. Well, there's proof of two with SH1 and the old mine at Apollo. And so you can just do that statistically. Do you think they're the only two on the island? Or you can look at what we do as scientists with the evidence and look for more of these zones, more high-grade gold at surface on these other targets with the lack of exploration. You know, we're there because we believe clearly there's a lot more than two. They vary in size typically. You know, you can get ore shoots up to as big as 1 million ounce themselves down to, 50 to 100,000 ounces. This is ultimately going to be made up of multiple shoots in that range. And I think it can host, to pick your number, a 1 to 3 million ounce range would be very typical for a system this size once it's had the systematic exploration it's required. We just want to get to 1 first because we know the re-rating that comes, and then show it beyond there. So that's why we did the deal on the project, because it's huge. It's got extremely high grade, even unusual high grade for an intermediate sulfidation system. And it's hardly been touched. And that's a very rare project in the world.
Okay, well, I'll hand it over to you to have some final closing comments, maybe touch on catalysts and close the webinar.
Yeah, so well, first of all, thank you to you, Michael. Thanks for coming up and being part of this. Thanks for everyone for listening. Hopefully it's been informative. We've got a huge district that we think we're starting to unlock. It's got extremely high grade. It just needs more work done to show that potential. We've got results coming from all 5 target areas that we drilled over the next probably 6 to 8 weeks. And then we want to keep the momentum. For the first time in 30 years, Unga started to see some continuous exploration. And we think if we can continue to drill holes like we returned in June and July, that we can very quickly get to that goal. So big district, hardly been touched. How often do you get multi-million ounce, 10 to 15 gram potential where you can get Amazon delivery that's the opportunity, and it's very rare to have that upside in a safe jurisdiction.
Very good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And we'll put a copy of the recording up on the website and share it. So thanks, everyone, and have a good weekend.
Cheers.